about topics for this. I don't think any of us thought we were going to be talking about spring freezes plural. So initially I was hoping to talk about some management stuff we've been seeing, but I think we really need to devote this time today to our freezes. And I think most of you know this is not necessarily wheat that I'm showing right now, but this is a barley variety that totally got blasted. This was out of Carl Bradley's scab nursery, where he was looking at resistance and fungicide application of different barley and wheat varieties. And he and I were both just really struck by how blasted this certain cultivar got. And actually, he was nice enough to let us go in and rate these plots. And in this variety, he had 100% freeze incidence. That means every head had some sort of freeze incident. So it was pretty striking this year. So just to move forward, I don't really want to belabor the weather data, but I do kind of want everyone to see sort of what happened. This year, our wheat was at advanced growth stages early in the season, and we don't really understand why. I wonder if it had to do with some really warm nighttime temperatures that we had. But I'm working with Matt Dixon out of UK Ag Weather Center to get my hands on some data, and maybe we can do a post-mortem of this season. But you can see that Matt was gracious enough. He threw this data together in like a day, and so I'm very grateful to him. A lot of these came from airports, and so this is the Bowling Green, Warren County Airport, and you can see that at that first freeze event, I'm calling it tax day freeze, right? Because we have to call it something funny. They had 5 hours that were less than or equal to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. He also gathered some data from some of these mesonets, and you can see some very extreme examples. Lexington Bluegrass Airport had 7 hours less than or equal to 30 at this first freeze event, and then 5 hours less than 28. And so these two different temperatures are really sort of these critical threshold temperatures at certain growth stages. And so typically 28 is when we might expect damage around that peak 7-8 timing. The 30 degrees Fahrenheit is where we're going to expect damage closer to the heading. And so this year at Princeton, the southern tier, some other areas this side of the state, we did have plants that were heading for this freeze event. And let's see if we can find Princeton. So Princeton, you can see here at my site, we had 6 hours that was less than the critical temperature for flowering, which I had plants that were flowering, and then 3 hours for that critical temperature that was at that peak 7, which is 2 joints or more. So the following night, there was also another freeze event, and these are just data I collected off the Mesonet site that was openly available. And I only included here any sort of freeze that occurred. So you'll see that Caldwell County or Princeton we did not have a freeze the second night. However, Fayette County also had another hard freeze, 4 hours less than 30 degrees. Henderson kind of got blasted, surprisingly, as well on this end of the state, where they had 3 hours on the second night. And so really, this had me very, very concerned, and anyone that grows any sort of wheat acreage was very concerned by this first freeze event. And so it's really hard to wait, but we all have to wait at least, 7 to 10 days to even determine the extent of this damage. And so this was about 10 to 14 days after the event. I was calling, emailing people that I knew had a lot of acreage or agents, and just trying to ascertain the damage. And really what we found is that most of the damage kind of occurred in this western part of the state, where we did have varieties that were flowering. There was some isolated, I'm going to call them isolated, but there was quite a bit of acreage that was impacted here in the central part of the state. And these were sort of the early maturing varieties, okay? So these early maturing varieties were close to heading when these two back-to-back freeze events occurred in April. And so what we were finding is that there was damage here at Princeton that ranged from about 10% of the heads had some sort of freeze damage all the way up to about 70%. And I'll show you some of that damage in a moment. But by far the median or most of the plots were in about a 10 or 15% damage rate. And it seemed to be positional where it was low-lying parts of the field, which isn't surprising, right? Low-lying parts of the field have 50, 60% damage. Like I said, Carl Bradley let me kind of go through all of his plots very graciously. And even in some of his wheat, he had some freeze damage as well. And so it wasn't just my plots. And so it was nice to get confirmation from other people in the state that this is maybe something we're gonna be seeing. And so, like I said, this is 100% severity. And this is kind of what we think of, right? When we think of freeze damage, these bright white awns, florets, heads. This is what we think. Okay, this is classic textbook freeze damage. And I guess it'll come as no surprise that we didn't exactly see that this year. There were some heads that had some more classical damage. You can see here on the left. Also on the right, this is very typical of freeze damage when it was kind of Feek 7, Feek 8, where it just kind of blasts this part of the head, and then anything that was closer to the ground or underground got protected, right? And so very typical freeze damage symptomology. And we did see some cases of that this year. But what I saw mostly, and what I heard from some consultants and some growers around the state, was more atypical symptomology. And so you can see here this wheat head on the left, kind of normal looking, you know, it's the normal sort of green. I hope this shows up okay on the screen, but if not, we will post these later to a website. And you know, this just looks like a normal wheat head. But then when you look to the right, you can see this one just looks a little pale, right? It just looks off. And when you start touching it, it feels empty. And you can also see that there's no anthers being extruded yet either. And so this was most of the damage that I was rating this year. And so it was fairly subtle and not quite as textbook as we might have thought. The other damage we were seeing was to the anthers, and that's really what this damage is, okay? So these are heads that had damage to the anthers. They did not pollinate, and so they just started, dying is not the right word, but they just stopped growing. And as you can see here, this head has emerged quite far. The peduncle is very long. And this one just stopped. And so Dave Van Sanford and I were talking before the field day, and that's kind of what we're seeing, is any of these damaged heads just sort of stopped whatever growth stage they were at, and they didn't continue to grow. So they just look off. So when you're talking about anthers, Dave did a good job showing sort of the physiology of the anthers and the flower. And just what I want to point out is recall his picture from earlier, and then this one as well. So this is a healthy sort of flower, and you can see this feathery, fluffy stigma that's receptive, so it's ready to have pollen pollinate it. And you can see that these anthers are very smooth. And if you're outdoors, they're shiny, they're turgid, they feel almost like plastic at this stage. And this is, they're green here because they're not quite ready to dehisce the pollen just yet, but they will start turning yellow. They will still stay very turgid, and you can, and when they start releasing the pollen, they feel very powdery, like talcum powder. So that's how you know that they're healthy and doing well. What we were seeing this year, and the damage I was seeing fairly early after the freeze, probably about 5 days, I wasn't quite seeing any color differences from the heads, but what I was seeing was all these white anthers. And I know this is a little bit blurry, but really what I want you to get from this picture is how white, bleached white these anthers are. And if you notice, you don't see a stigma anywhere. It's just, you don't see it because it's been damaged and is probably dead. Another thing we were seeing, which was bizarre, in my opinion, was yes, these anthers are yellow. They kind of look normal. The stigma looks fine, but when you kind of roll these anthers between your fingers, there was no pollen in them. And the thing I want to point out is that they're shriveled, they're kind of wrinkled, they just are not turgid and normal looking. And I know these are all very subjective sort of observations, but this is kind of what we were seeing in terms of damage. This was about 10 days after the freeze event. I think I see something coming in. Oh, Chad's saying great pics. Thanks. The next thing was that in some trials I had this year, we had several different seeding rates. We had about a half rate at about 18 seeds per square foot, 35, which is our sort of UK recommended. And then we went up to about 55 or 56. And so we saw quite a bit more damage in those higher seeding rates, which isn't all that surprising. But the damage we were seeing was on the peduncle. I don't know if you can see this sort of chlorotic yellow area here and even in the background. And so my concern with these is that maybe later in the season when they start feeling green, if they do, then they'll snap off before we can get them harvested. And so again, it's not uncommon, but it's a little atypical for some of the freeze symptomology we're used to seeing here in Kentucky. So that kind of brings us to our second freeze event. And so it's quite unusual to have a freeze event. I know our local meteorologist here at Princeton was saying if we actually did get to freezing, which we did, there was a 0% probability of that happening. So it's never happened before. If we had gotten to 32, 34, there would have been a 2% probability. So it had happened in the past since we've been keeping records. So as you can see from this, this screenshot from the Mesonet, pretty much everywhere in Kentucky, the night of May 9th, got to a low temperature that was at freezing or below, except for the far western part of our state. Even at Princeton, we had a freeze. So this was quite concerning, right? So when I started digging through that Mesonet data and kind of determining, okay, for wheat, we have to, well, any crop, we have to have 2 or more hours at freezing temperatures or whatever critical temperature it is to have some sort of damage. And so what we saw for the May 9th was that we had mostly the central part of the state that had 2 or more hours. And so these are just based on Mesonet locations. It doesn't mean that a freeze did not occur in these other states, in these other counties. So I was a little concerned about this repeated freeze, particularly given that most of the state was at flowering. So by May 9th, generally all locations within Kentucky were at flowering. And this is just an image of showing beginning flowering, which is 10-5-1, which is what Carl Bradley talks about all the time in terms of a fungicide application timing. And in wheat, it's really interesting, or maybe I'm just a big nerd. I just think it's very interesting that it goes from the middle of the plant up, and then after that, it matures down. And so it's a little different than some of the other row crops we grow. And so pretty much by this second freeze, most of the state was probably somewhere here. And so that's going to be a really big concern. We don't know yet. Like I said, with that first freeze event, we were just starting to get inklings of damage to the anthers 5 days. And of course, as time passes to that 7 to 10 days, we get a much better feeling for what the damage will be. But typically we think, according to the textbooks, that if we have some sort of freeze event here, or even during grain fill, so beyond flowering, we're going to be concerned about shriveled kernels. This is an image not from freeze damage. It's actually an image where these are shriveled due to high temperatures. But I suspect that this is something similar we'll see if your plants were in grain fill and they got a freeze for the May 9th compared to these nice plump, beautiful kernels to the right. And really, that's all I have. I think I've gotten a couple of questions. So I do have a question. What growth stage was your wheat when we had the freeze? So at the freeze for April here at Princeton, we probably were beginning heading, so maybe 10.3 or so. And so that's where we saw quite a bit of damage to anthers here. This past freeze event, we were definitely into grain fill, but we did not get temperatures for 2+ hours. But don't get me wrong, I'm going to be out inspecting to make sure that that the damage, that the freeze didn't impact this at all. So what questions do you all have? I feel like I didn't provide much information, and I don't really want to be a fearmonger either, but I think this year these freezes are quite concerning in terms of our wheat crop for much of the state. Usually we have little pockets in the state, right? This year it seems to be statewide.
So other questions for Carrie, either in the text or the chat.
Carrie, you mentioned 7 to 10 day window. So if someone were trying to assess the potential damage, do you have a sampling scheme you would recommend? Because we see, in fields that I've looked at in the plots, a lot of variability. Some heads look just Jim dandy and others look like they've been hit. So what's a strategic way to try and estimate the damage?
So I think, Dave, what I would do is start with the low spots, just to understand that where the greatest damage may occur. And then I would go out just to representative spots in the field. Of course, I would get away from field edges. Don't just be looking from a windshield, because a lot of the damage we saw this year we would not see from a windshield. Go into the plots 50, 100 feet, get representative areas, and just try to make sure that you understand what it is. Not the worst, not the best case, but a representative sort of area, representative seating rates, stands, that kind of thing. So don't go to the spots that have the lowest stand, because they're likely going to have less damage. So, and look a lot of places. I mean, we took a lot of assessments. We were on buckets a long time at these plots.
Hey, Carrie, you've got one chat that said the wheat in Warren County had a frost on the heads for about an hour and a half. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, frosts don't bother me. And that's just because you can get a frost and, for an hour and a half. I would scout it, Mike. But they say that I'm having a hard time with my words today, guys. Sorry. They say that the magic number is 2+ hours. And so an hour and a half would be very concerning, and I would go out and scout frequently. But my gut would tell me that maybe there's not a severe damage that occurred, hopefully.
So it's fair to say, Carrie, that probably over this next week to 2 weeks, some scouting is going to be really important to assess
Yes.
what we've got.
And for me, I was able to see that damage much better closer to that 2-week mark. And that's a horrible thing to say. And I understand that fully, especially with the timing we are right now. It's just hard to wait 2 weeks to understand what the damage is, but that's where we were seeing. The only upside I can say is that I think the host date's supposed to be about 80 this weekend, right? So that might accelerate some of the symptomology development, and we might not have to wait the full 2 weeks, but for sure 7 days is pretty much a minimum. 5 days it's going to give you just a beginning understanding, but 7 to 10 days is much better.
Yeah, this is not like some of the tree fruits where you can see the flowers very quickly, or even young corn plants right now that are showing the symptoms very quickly. It's a very, I think that's probably the frustrating part for a lot of people, is that this one takes a while to really see the development occur in the crop. So,
and I think the confounding factor here too is a lot of people want to know if they need to be spraying for a head fungicide, right?
mm-hmm.
And so I think, like Carl said this morning, and if we think that we just have to understand or hope that we understand whether there's going to be a kernel there or not. So waiting 5 days can be a long time for the head scabs, but he has done some work that shows even up to 5 to 7 days after flowering that you can still get very good control of dawn accumulation. And so it might be worth waiting a few days this year just to understand what's going on with your wheat crop before you spray.
Okay. With that, I'm going to pull the poll up and launch it. Carrie has some specific questions for you.
And I know y'all have had a lot of polls today, guys, but I would really appreciate, these polls are very important to us. I would like to understand a couple of these questions. I kind of had them worded very confusing. Hopefully Chad got them cleaned up for me. But I kind of want to understand what sort of, what percentage of your acreage you think got damaged in these freeze events, sort of the severity. So of this damage, like what percentage you're seeing of heads affected, 10%, 50%, which is kind of what we were seeing. And then also what's your gut telling you about the current freeze. And so this will help me a lot understand kind of what's going on in the state. Then also some of these questions that Chad's talking about are very important for us so that we know that we're getting you sort of the information you want. So please be assured that there's probably about 20 of us that read these surveys very closely. So your participation is really nice to have so that we get a program that you guys want and need.
Yeah, and so while you're answering that, the one thing we usually do every year on that survey is we ask a question about topics for next year. And I think when we get to the end of the field day, we'll just ask you to put it in the chat, and you can send it to everybody. That's fine, in terms of topics you might like to hear in that regard, so that we can have some feedback that way. It's like most of you are finding the questions. I think there's 5 in here total, and these all relate to the wheat freeze, wheat management talk that went on. And so we'll give a few more minutes for folks to answer some of these. This is a little bit, I think people are really trying to think about what they got, Carrie. And
yeah, this might take a few minutes. Sorry, guys, to eat it up.
How severe it might be in some areas, right?
The other thing is Chad and I are probably going to get some blogs out very quickly, not just on wheat, but also corn and beans, the freeze damage as well. So please be looking at our blog, our websites. We'll probably tweet when we do that too, right, Chad? just to get that information out there. I'm going to try and get these pictures online so that you can see them better, because probably on Zoom the resolution wasn't super great. This year also gave me the opportunity to develop a extension publication. So for future freeze events, I guess one good thing about this one is I have a lot of good pictures to show the damage across lots of different growth stages. And so if we're trying to look for a rainbow here, maybe that's one thing. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be optimistic.
Okay. All right. We've got, it looks like we've kind of stopped at the number that are responding. So I'm going to end this poll and I'll share it with everybody. Let's bring that up. And